All right, the recording has started. Okay, well, gentlemen, welcome to Altitude Diving. My name is Benjamin. I'll be your instructor this evening. I'm a specialty instructor for Altitude Diving, as well as a dive master instructor and a technical diving instructor. This will be taught with slides as well as audio presentation. We are recording this for your amusement as well as mine, as well as for quality control for later on. You'll have the ability to go back to this presentation for the next 30 days and spend the time and go through it and listen to it again if you should have questions. As we go through, please make sure you keep your cameras on. If you turn your camera on, I'll ask you a lot of questions. If you keep your camera on, I'll ask you less questions, but I'll still ask questions. Through the course of the presentation, I will ask questions as we go to gauge knowledge. And at the end of it, we'll do an oral final exam to make sure that you have a competent quality understanding of this. As well. At the end of this, you will need to pop into the shop. I'll have some paperwork for you as well, and you'll just need to sign an initial to say that you are now rejoining the United States Marine Corps December 5.
That wouldn't take me anywhere.
Hold on, wait, hold on.
Wait, stop. So congratulations, you've just been conscripted to the United States Marine Corps again. You started out a private, just so you know. So perfect. Well, so welcome in. As you guys know, you both know me pretty well, but I definitely prefer to dive locally and at high altitude. There's a lot of really interesting and neat things to see overall. So some of my favorite dives, the one on the left-hand side that you're looking at is...
You're not sharing your screen.
Let me
share
my screen here. Sorry, I get excited apparently. Let's see, we're share a window. The pegs over here. There we go. All right, coming up now.
There we go.
Shared screen. There we go. Now you should be able to see my screen. Fantastic. So again, there's my card for being able to instruct this. My favorite dive on this left-hand side is Yellowstone Lake. Yellowstone Lake is 7,600 foot elevation, so it's definitely an altitude dive. We're going to talk a little bit about the dynamics of diving at a high altitude like that, preparation and things to be aware of, as well as how to use tables and safety as well. Through the SSI course, to become comfortable and confident divers, it takes 4 ingredients: proper knowledge, and I'm going to work on that this evening to make sure you guys have the knowledge to be able to confidently and comfortably dive at altitude. I'm going to give you the skills, and we're going to go through two big, really there's 2 big takeaways from this, and they're both math skills. They're both very simple. So even a crayon eater can do it. So it's good to go. So we're going to give you some proper skills with that. We're going to talk about the proper equipment as well. Definitely diving altitude definitely presents a few additional challenges that you may or may not have considered. Proper experience is the last piece of this puzzle. For me, that's actually a twofold process. So I'm going to work hard to give you the experience so that you're able to comfortably do it, but I want to give you an experience that you enjoy as well. So I feel like that's 2 sides of a coin of types of experience that make sure that you're comfortable doing what you're doing. To give you an idea, this is Bear Lake, and I've got a nice little video presentation for you to give you an idea what it looks like diving at altitude in something like Bear Lake. I'm going to back this up and potentially it'll start. If it doesn't start, luckily we happen to have a YouTube channel under Teach Me to Dive. You're welcome to go online, and I have all these videos placed on that as well. It's not looking good for YouTube today. I've had a weird time with YouTube in the last few weeks. Sometimes it just really does a great job, and sometimes I get the spinning wheel of death. But as you can see through this process, I guess we'll just have to be able to go through it manually. You can see the water is very clear, and definitely a very different dive. It's very blue at Bear Lake, and you definitely get a lot of really great, interesting things and formations. In freshwater diving, you tend to get more geological formations than fish, but Bear Lake is one of the few places that you can get into fish. They have 2 types of suckers there that are pretty interesting. So, and you can, if you're careful and quiet and you go in the morning, you can usually get into a school of 40 to 60, 2 to 2.5, 3 foot sucker fish. And they're definitely very curious about you as well, as long as you don't make sudden movements, right? It's kind of like dealing with women. Don't make sudden movements, just, move slowly and cautiously, right? So there we go. So diving at altitude. Today's objective is because of the reduced atmospheric pressure, dives conducted at altitude require more decompression than that of identical dives conducted at sea level. The standard dive tables can't be used as written. So through this class, we're going to learn several altitude approaches to determine safe diving practices for diving at altitude, as well as additional safe diving practices, as well and some emergency procedures. So discussion, guys, what does altitude diving mean to you?
Diving at anything but sea level.
Okay. How about you, Aaron?
I'd say the same thing, just mountain lakes or, I don't know, above sea level.
Okay. So there is a definition to altitude. The altitude is going to be any dive that is above 1,000 feet sea level. So anything below that is going to, you can use the same sea level tables, but once you start getting above 1,000 feet, you're going to be in altitude diving. Now, the thing is a majority of inland diving is at altitude and can present additional risks that may not be as simple as diving at sea level. So this course is going to prepare you to execute those dives and that understand the additional challenges provided with that and execute these dives between 1,000 feet and 10,000 feet. Now, it's important to note on this that there is a second set of tables built by the U.S. Navy. It's in revision 7 of the U.S. Navy Dive Manual that talks about specifically diving at above 10,000 feet. It is about a page and a half. So they haven't done that much research either. But then again, I mean, how many navies need to be above 10,000 feet? Just saying, you know, the Idaho Coast Guard always just tickles my fancy, right? So, guys, some of the things we're going to go through today, we're going to talk about the definitions and benefits of altitude diving. We're going to do a little review on Boyle's Law, talk about dive planning and what a sea level equivalent depth and calculation is. Now, that's a term you'll definitely want to remember, sea level equivalent depth or the SLED. So we're going to talk about how to adjust the ascent as well as safety stops, additional thermal protection, the pre-dive checks and preparation, air delivery systems, typical conditions in lakes and rivers, emergency procedures, as well as common altitude dive maladies and preventions, and then after the dive travel, which is very important. As we go through this, I want to commend you guys for taking altitude diving, but also to remind you that if you don't have DAN dive insurance, it is to your advantage. Specialized accident insurance from DAN is extremely inexpensive. It's about $200 a person for an entire year for their big daddy of all insurance. Available for divers 70 and over. That covers you, Aaron, so you're good to go. And in the US and Canada, plus recognized worldwide. They do a fantastic job. Covers divers diving and non-diving and named water sport accidents and injuries as well. So if you haven't signed up for DAN insurance, about $200 a year sounds pretty cheap. When you think about it, a ride in a helicopter to the emergency room is going to cost you $10,000 to $20,000, and a day in a chamber will give you another $10,000 to $20,000. And then that doesn't even count the $500 aspirin and $200 Kleenex. So this insurance will break even if you get one tissue from the emergency room. It is a profit for you if you get two, right? So that's my my pitch for Dan for the day. I don't make anything, and I'm not a paid spokesman. So guys, be aware, areas for altitude diving, mountainous regions above 1,000 feet, high plains areas that are not obviously high altitude or as mountainous regions, but are above 1,000 feet. Now, the maximum recommended altitude for what we're diving, what I'm going to teach you is going to be 10,000 feet and below, but above 1,000 feet. All right. So interestingly enough, the world record for diving, though, was set by Marcel Corcus back in 2019, and he dove at a record 20,981 feet above sea level. He discovered the highest lake in the world in where did he? I'm trying to remember where he discovered it, but it's in South America, and decided to hike all his crap up there and dive at that amazing depth. He discovered the lake in 2016. It was the highest lake on Earth, and so here's a little picture of him sticking his little head above the water to prove that he did his dive. Why he did it is basically the way we do. Reason we do everything is because you could, right? So some of the benefits of high altitude diving, in my opinion, and as well as exercise apparently, is you get the opportunity to find and preserve artifacts. A good example of that is Yellowstone Lake. There are a lot of artifacts and different things in the lake. By the way, it's illegal to take them or touch them, but you'll find, for example, one of the spots we have found medicine and liquor bottles from the 20s. There's another place off where there used to be a dining pier off the north end of the lake that you can find pieces of china from the 1800s and parts of the original dock. So there's things that happen in the lake. In Lake Tahoe, the SS Tahoe, I always want to say the USS Tahoe, but it's just the SS Tahoe, was a paddle ship that steamed people around the lake. It was sunk purposely at about 400 feet in the lake. And it's in pristine, beautiful condition. So if you ever feel like you want to do a really amazing dive and happen to have a huge team and be in your trimix, or you happen to be CCR certified, that's a fantastic dive. About 6 to 8 people in the world have ever touched the deck of the SS Tahoe since it's been sunk. But it is in beautiful condition. I've seen video of it. It is absolutely amazing. So other things you can see that are kind of interesting. I'm going to stop sharing this for just a second.
That looks like an accident.
I'm sorry about that, guys.
Found the wrong button.
I pushed the wrong button. Luckily, it's still recording. I'm going to stop sharing. I've already stopped sharing, and I'm going to show you a fun video of other opportunities. Dustin or Donnie, I don't think you've seen this yet. Maybe you have. I think I texted over, but Aaron has not, I'm pretty sure. Another example of high altitude diving, of course, is ice diving. Let's see. Let's put this over here. And I happen to have it. There we go. Let me just pull this over to a screen here so you guys can see it. Share a window. There you go. And again, all these videos are on our YouTube channel. You're more than welcome to enjoy them there. Go often and watch as much as you can. There you go. So fun little ice video showing what one of the things that is possible for when we are diving in high altitude. I have yet to see a frozen over lake in Florida. So I'm hoping one day to see that, but I'm not sure at the rate of hell's freezing over this week, but maybe one day it will. Anyway, that's some of the opportunities. High altitude lakes, ice diving in the winter, rivers, streams, all that fun stuff as well. So as we go through this, my question for you guys is, when is a scuba cylinder empty?
500 psi.
I'd say
Aaron, when is it actually empty? When is it fully empty?
14.9 psi.
There you go. And that's not too far from the truth. But the thing about it is, I'm going to
At altitude, it's 14.6 or something, 14.5.
Yep, absolutely. So here's the thing to be aware of. Your scuba cylinder is empty when the pressure is equal to the absolute pressure. So there must be a difference between in pressure of the air to flow in and out of the cylinder. So that's when your cylinder is actually empty, right? Does that make sense, guys?
Yep.
Okay. So your scuba cylinder is considered empty at the surface when it reaches 1 atmosphere. Now, if we take that same cylinder to an altitude of 16,000 feet, which is half of the atmospheric pressure, 50%, open the valve and air will flow out. So the pressure decrease and the volume will increase. So basically boil, the boiling reverse of what we're used to dealing with. Now it'll the volume will increase and air will flow out until the cylinder is equalized. Now let's take that example to depth. Your cylinder, your dive cylinder, is also empty at 16 feet when the pressure reaches 1.5 atmospheres, equaling the absolute pressure. Does that make sense?
Do you have your slideshow back up? We're not seeing that.
Oh no, I'm just talking to you guys at this point.
I didn't know if you had
I do have more slides, but I'm just talking to you guys at this point. So does that make sense to you guys? That if you take an empty cylinder, anybody ever taken a bag of chips on a mountain pass you get it in Idaho Falls and then you drive up through the mountain pass, right? And all of a sudden the bag of chips is a lot more. That's because we have a variation in atmospheric pressure. So your cylinder becomes empty when the atmospheric pressure equalizes and is at the same point, right? Now, interesting enough, on a side note, that's kind of illustrate the point. I was doing a deep diving class with a student where I had a pony bottle and a back cylinder, right? And so my pony bottle is only 30 cubic foot that I was carrying. And I was working with my student and I went ahead and I wanted to breathe it dead anyway, because I needed to send it over for a visual inspection and then to get refilled. So I decided I breathed it completely empty. And then when I got to the point where there was no more air, we were at 66 feet, I went ahead and started an ascent. Now, please keep in mind, I had plenty of back gas that I could easily switch to. I could have taken the regulator out, put another regulator in at any time. I was completely safe. So there's my safety caveat for the day. But I kept the regulator in my mouth and I started the ascent. How many breaths do you think I got from 66 feet to 15 feet?
2 or 3.
2. I got 2 full, strong breaths. I actually got almost a third out, another third breath out of it. But it wasn't quite a full breath. But I did. I just left the regulator in my mouth, and I started my ascent. I got to about 40 feet, and I go. Right, I got a nice full breath. So as the pressure decreased, the volume increased. Okay. Now, safety point. In this case of an out of air ascent, This is why SSI encourages you to always leave your primary regulator in your mouth. As you ascend, pressure is going to decrease and volume is going to increase, and the air should flow into the delivery system, providing you some air on ascent. So that's why we do that. That's the whole reason, right? So the pressure describes a force per unit area, and the mathematical formula for that is pressure equals force divided by area, or P equals F over A, right? Does that make sense to you guys?
Right.
So atmospheric pressure is air pressure at sea level is known as atmospheric pressure. And the common unit for atmospheric pressure in the imperial measurement system is ATA at sea level. So at sea level, 1 atmospheric pressure is defined as 1 ATA. Make sense?
Yes.
That's going to be very important here in just a little bit. Now, the next thing to kind of be aware of is hydrostatic pressure. And hydrostatic pressure is the weight exerted by fluid or water due to the force of gravity. Hydrostatic pressure comes from the weight of water, excluding the air pressure. So hydrostatic pressure is commonly expressed in pressure per unit, or PSI, okay, or pressure per unit of depth. So 1 ATA equivalent in water pressure is 1 ATA. Now, to be aware of that, and to add to that confusion, 1 ATA of seawater is 33 feet. 1 atmosphere additional of fresh water is 34 feet. Donnie, why is there a difference between those two?
Because of the salinity of the water.
Absolutely. So salinity, the salt adds weight, right?
Right.
Exactly. So as you go through SSI courses, I encourage you strongly to write this number down. Fresh water exerts 14.7 psi divided by 34 feet, or 0.432 psi per foot for fresh water. Memorizing 0.432 freshwater psi per foot is just a good thing, because I promise you that question will come up, and it'll come up, and it'll come up, and it'll come up. It'll come up enough times that you will be happy that you memorized 0.432. Now, saltwater exerts slightly more. And it just exactly like Don expressed earlier, is because it's heavier, because it has salinity, because it has salt in it, right? So it's 14.7 psi divided by 33, and because we have 1 foot less there, it becomes a little heavier. So it's 0.445 psi per foot. Now, if you can write those two numbers down, maybe tattoo them on your forearm, or indelibly print them on your brain, it will definitely be to your advantage. And as I just may have mentioned, that comes up a lot. There's a high likelihood that one of those two numbers is going to come up on the final exam. Just saying. I might be psychic and have seen the exam before. So, all right. So gauge pressure, we also have to deal with. Gauge pressure is used primarily for the diver's information system. Now, gauge pressure does not take into account atmospheric pressure. So in other words, the specific pressure being measured does not include the atmospheric pressure. The depth gauge is calibrated to 0 at sea level and measures depth in feet seawater. So the air pressure gauge will read 0 when the cylinder is off and all other than the ambient pressure is out of the high pressure hose. Cylinder pressure is measured in pounds per square inch, okay? Or pounds per square inch gauge if you want to do the full thing. So PSI is measured, that's how we measure gauge pressure. And then finally, atmospheric pressure. So the term atmospheric pressure is used to describe the total pressure exerted on an object, you as the diver. So guys, we're sitting at the surface. You are experiencing 1 atmospheric pressure, the weight of the entire atmosphere on you. So as you descend, there is an increase in pressure due to the additional weight of the water, the hydrostatic pressure. Now, absolute pressure is the sum of the air, atmospheric pressure, plus the water, the hydrostatic pressure, okay? Absolute pressure is commonly expressed in bar. So the water, or the hydrostatic pressure, increases at a rate of 1 additional atmosphere of pressure for every 33 feet of depth we descend in seawater or saltwater, and or 34 feet in fresh water. So the sampled, and I would write this down, guys. The formula for that is going to be absolute pressure, or ATA, equals depth feet seawater divided by 33 divided by 1 divided by atmosphere divided by plus 1. So let me write that, give you that to you one more time. Atmospheric pressure, ATA, is equal to depth feet seawater or feet freshwater divided by 33 or 34, depending if we're doing freshwater or seawater, divided by atmosphere plus 1. That's our absolute pressure. Now, how we figure that out, right? So if we're going through and we're trying to figure out what our actual depth is, we say 33 feet divided by 33 feet seawater divided by our atmosphere pressure. We're at 2 atmospheres plus 1. So now we know we're at 2 atmospheres for 33 feet. Does that make sense? So that's why 33 feet is 2 atmospheres, 34 or 66 feet is 3 atmospheres, because we go down 1 full atmosphere plus 1. Does that make sense, guys?
Right.
So at each atmosphere we go down, you just have to make sure we add back in for absolute pressure the surface tension. It's easy to get confused as we're putting this together and say, okay, we're at 99 feet. That's 3 atmospheres down, but no, that's 4 atmospheres, because we always have to make sure to add back in the surface tension as well. Make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So we have something called equilibration at altitude. So as we ascend to altitude, 2 things happen. The body starts off gas, right? We know this because as we come up out of the water column from depth, our body's off gassing. But the exact same thing happens when you go up in an airplane. The exact same thing happens if we go from here to Denver being about 3,000 feet higher than us, right? I think at least isn't Denver at 8,000 feet? If I remember right.
They call it the Mile High City because it's 5,280 feet.
Okay, so
yeah.
So if we go to Yellowstone, which is 7,000 feet, 2,000 feet, as we go up in atmosphere, we're going to be off gassing because our bodies want to be equal. They want to be an equalization and equilibrium to everything around us. Anybody ever lived at sea level and then suddenly went to Denver or to a high altitude and decided to go for a run?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. It's miserable, right? The problem is your body hasn't found equalization and equilibrium yet. Our bodies are designed to be in equilibrium with the gases around us. That's why if we go down to 300 feet and we're breathing the right gas, of course, we can get to that point. We can stay there as long as we need to, because our bodies will equalize to the gases around us. So now as we ascend, the body's going to off gas that excess nitrogen, just like we're coming out of the water column, to come up into equilibration with the lower partial pressure of nitrogen in the atmosphere. It also begins a series of complicated adjustments to the lower partial pressure of oxygen as well. Now, the first portion is called equilibration. The second is called acclimatization. Approximately 12 hours at altitude is required for equilibration. A longer period of time is required for acclimation, right? You don't just drive to Denver or drive to Jackson, for example, and all of a sudden the next day you're ready to go run a mile at your best time ever, right? It takes time. Your body will come into equilibration within about 12 hours, right? Now, does anybody ever remember, has everybody heard that 12-hour mark anywhere else in diving before?
The time before you're allowed to fly.
That's 24 hours. So you're on the right path. How about the dive tables?
That gets you back to an A-level diver.
Exactly. So 12 hours on the surface starts a new dive day for you, puts you back to a 0 nitrogen load or residual nitrogen load that's sufficient enough to start you back as an A group diver without having residual nitrogen to have to account in for. So the same thing happens as we go up. If I drive from here to Jackson or here to Yellowstone in 12 hours, the nitrogen will be equal to the surrounding area. The oxygen partial pressure will be equal to that. Now I haven't acclimatized to that. My body's still trying to figure out how to work and how to run and how to literally do anything at that higher higher altitude or lower partial pressure of oxygen and lower partial pressure of nitrogen, but at least the nitrogen has and the oxygen partial pressures have equalized in my system. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Aaron, do you get in a roundabout way?
Yes.
You look like you got a question on your face, so I'm gonna make sure you're clear.
My face is just in the dark, so
Okay. So it's the same thing as diving, right? If we go down to 100 feet, we stay there for 30 minutes. As we come back up, we have to off gas that nitrogen. Our body has to get back into an equilibrium with every step of the stage as we're doing our ascent. Does that make sense, guys? Same thing as at the surface. And it's one of the things that we don't think about very often is as we start to raise in altitude, same thing as we get on the plane, right? Anybody ever felt a little lightheaded on a plane? Yeah, it happens.
Sure.
I mean, you're dealing at 10,000 foot elevation is what you're dealing. They pressurize the cabin to 10,000 feet. And so now you're at this 10,000 foot elevation you have, which is literally 60% of the normal oxygen that you're used to breathing, 60% of the nitrogen that you're used to breathing. So everything has to go into equilibration. So equilibration at altitude, if a diver begins a dive at altitude with within 12 hours of arriving at his location, the residual nitrogen left over from sea level must be taken into account. So in effect, the initial dive at altitude can be considered a repetitive dive, with the first dive being the ascent from sea level to altitude. So a simple way to figure this is to increase your residual nitrogen group by 1 letter group for every 1,000 feet of gain in altitude. So let's think about that for a moment again. So if I drive from here to Yellowstone and I'm at 4,500 foot elevation and all of a sudden I'm at 7,600 foot elevation, I've literally climbed 3,000 feet. In that time, if I dive anywhere within that first 12 hours, it's a repetitive dive. I'm still off gassing nitrogen to equalize to the area that I'm at. So a simple factor to remember is that I need to take into account and do 1 letter group down for my residual nitrogen factor by 1 letter group for every 1,000 feet that I've climbed. So all of a sudden, let's take a look at that. I happen to have a chart here. Present now, a window. Let me know when you can see my screen.
That's it.
Excellent. So example, Jim drives from Idaho Falls, 4,500 foot elevation to Yellowstone Lake, 7,500 foot of elevation. Jim gains 3,000 feet in elevation. To compensate for this elevation increase, Jim will need to start his group as a letter group D. So he was an A, 1 letter group, 1,000 feet, 2 letter group, 1,000 feet, 3 letter group for 1,000 feet. So simple enough. He was an A, 1, 2, 3 makes him a D. So now we know that he is now a D group diver. Now, or he must wait 5 hours and 49 minutes to return to be an A group diver. So as soon as I get there, if I wait for 5 hours and 49 minutes or longer, then I revert back to being an A group diver. And we can do that with any amount at altitude. If you go from being at sea level to being at 10,000 feet, we can do that. It's literally a matter of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So I'm starting out as a K group diver. To become an A group diver, I need to sit out and wait before I do my dive for basically 9 hours, 8 hours and 59 minutes. So 9 hours. Simple enough?
Yes.
Perfect. So that's the first thing we need to be aware of is as we start to ascend from one elevation to another, even at Ryrie, I mean, we're not going up a lot, but we're certainly going up some, right? If you come from Pocatello, which is at 4,000 feet, to Ryrie, which is 5,120 feet, you need to be aware that once you get there, you are now a B group diver. You've ascended 1,000 feet. So we definitely need to make sure we take some time to acclimatize. Don't just drive up there and run and jump in the water, right? Realize that now you're a B group diver. And while that's not a big risk, it's something to be aware of. So I think we've talked a lot about this, but ice diving is one of my favorite things. Donnie had the experience to do that. Donnie, want to tell us about your experience ice diving?
Sure. It was quite different than what I'm used to. Because I've dove lakes, freshwater, but both dealing with an overhead environment, limited visibility, as well as the extreme cold all at once was a challenge. Especially considering my use of a new set of gear, it was definitely a challenge.
Excellent. How was buoyancy for you? Was it a little different in the cold?
Buoyancy was a little bit weird. I tried a couple different weights, like totals, to try to get to a point where I felt comfortable, and it was really easy to go from not quite enough weight, because I kept adding weight and it wasn't quite enough. I think that was mostly because of insulating layers, but then also at one point I added too much weight, and that wasn't helpful either.
Fair enough. So it's definitely a different experience. Cold definitely makes for a different dive. So I definitely encourage taking our ice diving course like Donnie did. He's and I think you learned quite a bit. So let's talk a little bit about Boyle's Law. Remember, Boyle's Law is pretty straightforward. Boyle's basically says, or Marriott, if you want to be a little French and sound cool, that I'll give you the laws for Boyle or Marriott. So they lived about the same time. They're about 9 years apart, figuring out their dynamic. But they basically express that as pressure increases, volume decreases. As volume or as pressure decreases, volume increases. Now, the thing about this is that it also applies to a lot of different ideas. So as we go through this, we get the idea that 33 feet seawater at 2 atmospheres has an ambient pressure of 29.4 or a 50% volume change. So literally the density of the gas we're breathing is twice as much. And we have half as much volume. Now, Aaron, why might that be important to understand why volume is important in a tank at 33 feet seawater versus at sea level or at the surface?
Your volume is bigger at the surface than it is when you're down, so you have less air to breathe, or you're breathing more condensed air, so you get less breaths.
Absolutely. So you can look at it two ways. Either I have condensed air, so I have half the volume that I'm used to, or I'm breathing twice the density of it. Now, you bring up an interesting point to be aware of. As we're diving, one of the things that most people don't take into account is the density of the gas. And as you start going farther into technical diving, this becomes extremely important. There's only a certain density of gas that you can honestly breathe and not cause yourself to go into a cardiac arrest. Your lungs are only designed for a certain density, right? So be aware of that. As the water gets colder and as air gets colder, it becomes more dense automatically, right? The good news is generally when it gets cold, it's because we're at higher altitude, so it has a lower weight to it already. But the effects of altitude on atmospheric pressure, the role of atmospheric pressure in a dive table calculation are definitely important to take into account, and they have to do with Boyle's Law. Now, as we start rising in altitude, we start having a reduced atmospheric pressure. So as we start going higher in the altitude, we have lower partial pressure to deal with. For example, right now, as we sit, we're literally here in Idaho Falls, we're sitting at about 16% less atmospheric pressure than they have at sea level. So if the weight of the water is different, and the weight of the air is different, it's going to cause a difference in density, and it's going to cause a difference in volume as well. Now, if we have a difference in density of what we're starting to do, what do you think that's going to happen to our theoretical depth, Donnie?
Let's see. That would decrease our theoretical depth because we have less ambient pressure on top of the... No, that's not right.
You're on the right train of thought.
I'm not quite sure.
Flip the coin. You have a beeper. So, for example, if I'm diving a 16% difference in ambient pressure in altitude here at Ryrie, and I go down to 100 feet, how deep is my theoretical depth, do you think?
16% deeper.
Exactly. That's exactly right, Aaron. So now if I've got a 16% variance because of the atmospheric pressure, not as much pressure on, it's causing a deeper pressure on the water. So my theoretical depth at sea level is now going to be 16% deeper. So if I dive 100 feet in Ryrie and there's 16% atmospheric differentiation, then now all of a sudden I'm diving 116 feet.
I don't know if I quite follow that. Like, if we're at altitude, and I get that, like, yes, it's theoretically deeper, but like, why is it that less, like, ambient pressure, 16% less pressure at the surface? Like, how does that equate to more pressure at depth?
It's reducing the atmospheric pressure that's coming up from sea level. So as it reduces it up, it's also reducing the actual depth for us. So instead, it pulls everything up. So it means we're actually 16% deeper than what we think. So you have a reduced pressure at the surface. You're doing a calculation to reduce and change the depth and dynamic from sea level. So what it would be at sea level, it would be 16% less at sea level, because you have a 16% variance.
Is that because the gauge is not accurate to the actual water depth in feet? Oh,
Correct.
okay. Now I'm following.
There you go. Yep. So remember, all our gauges are balanced at sea level. So we're actually 16% deeper than what we think. And so we call it theoretical depth because we can't calculate it as easily. And the downside is all computers will give you the actual depth, not the theoretical depth, but they will take into account elevation. A lot of computers will take into account the elevation correction, and they'll figure that into your algorithm for your time at depth. So they'll take into account, they'll show you an actual depth, but they won't, they'll calculate it on theoretical depth, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yes.
So you'll still think you're at 33 feet, but you're not. You're actually much deeper than that.
Why don't they design the dive computers to read to you the actual or the theoretical depth?
They're not able to. They because of the way they're built and the way they're set up, they have to read a gauge depth, which is based upon level accuracy.
Gotcha.
Absolutely. So, review question for you: at sea level, a flexible container, gas-filled container, submerged to 33 feet fresh water. At that depth, it has a volume of 1 cubic feet. What will happen to the volume if the container is brought directly to the surface?
Let's see. Yeah, it'll expand to 2 cubic feet.
2 cubic feet is exactly right. So B. So remember, we have a 50% differentiation change between 33 feet of depth and the surface. So it's going to double. Easy enough. Good job, Aaron, or Donnie, I mean.
Thanks.
All righty. So dive planning. Theoretical depth calculations. Samples should be calculated at a sea level equivalent depth table using either ATM or hectosphere pressure unit. Now note, most common dive tables rely on the minimum hydrostatic cap of 1.0 at the surface. Okay. Now what that means to you is if I were to pull up on my handy dandy gauge pressure, let's see, and I've got it right here, what sea level is at right now, altimeter. Let's see, right now sea level is reading at 1.01. So that's how pressure works. Is it's very rare that it's at a perfect 1.0, but just realize for ultimate accuracy that is absolutely the case, and that we run these calculations at 1.0. Okay, so here's how we figure out the equivalent depth versus the actual depth. And here's your example: equivalent depth of 49 feet freshwater multiplied by 1 divided by 0.864. And now where do I get that 0.864? That's at a 4,000 foot elevation. And this is a standard variation table right now, just to give you an idea. The current pressure where we're at right now is 0.85. So it's definitely a variance, but this gets us in the ballpark. So how we figure this out is we do 49 feet multiplied by 1 divided by 0.864. And here's where I got that. The altitude pressure variation, the pressure at 4,000 feet should be about 0.864. So I divide that by 1 and then multiply by the 49 feet. So what I come up with is 1.157. Okay, so 1 divided by 0.0864, the altitude pressure, multiplied by 49 feet seawater equals 57 feet. My new theoretical depth, if I'm diving 49 feet, is now 57 feet. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So the easiest way to do that is find what the atmospheric pressure of what you're currently at. What I use is Dive Buddy calculator for my Dive Buddy to figure this out. So that works very, very well, and it's fairly accurate. If you don't have access to that, for example, you're in Yellowstone Lake, you can also print off and carry this table with you. Easy enough. And there's also a depth calculation chart as well. So simple enough. That's how you put it together to figure out your equivalent depth. So theoretical difference is atmospheric pressure at altitude divided by sea level atmospheric pressure minus 1. So in this particular case, the actual atmospheric pressure where I'm at is 0.8353 atmospheres. The atmospheric pressure at sea level is 0.9927. So you could say 1 equals 0.8414, gives me a 15.86 difference. So it's 15.86% difference. Does that make sense? And I'm happy to send this slide to you guys as well, so to help you remember. In a minute, I'll make it even easier for you. So this is how you figure out actual equivalent depth. Here's our at sea level right here. You can see it at the bottom. Pressure at sea level is 0.9927. Pressure at where I'm currently at was 0.8353. I divide those two out. Minus 1 equals 15%. Does that make sense, guys? Who needs me to email this to them?
I follow.
Okay, good. So theoretical depth is 15.86% deeper than actual depth. So 100 foot dive at this, we're saying this at this dive was 4,699 feet. So the equivalent depth of 100 feet is now 116 feet, theoretical depth. Always round down. Now, if you like to make your life even easier, here's a simpler process for you. You can either go to My Dive Buddy. There's a mobile calculator. Looks just like this. Let's go to it real quick and I'll show you what it looks like. If we're diving at 4,600 feet, we want to dive to, I like using 100. It just makes it easier. Okay, calculate. Here we go. Your theoretical ocean depth is 115 feet seawater. Use this depth when planning your dive. Your safety stop should be 13 feet freshwater. The surface air temperature is 0.844 atmospheres. It's just an app on that you can download, or not download, but go to on a browser. Gives you that information. Here's a simpler way to do this, and this will get you close enough for most light to medium technical dives, as well as all recreational dives. If you were to simply add 3.5% for every 1,000 feet that you ascend at where you're at, that will get you close enough. There's also in the Navy dive tables, as well as in the book, in the SSI app, there's also a sea level equivalent depth that you can get. You can also download, and if you really want to get accurate, you can also download a barometric pressure for your iPhone or Android. Other ways to do this, I use Subsurface Dive Planner. It is free. They do have Mac and PC versions. You guys are both taking my technical class, so you will definitely want to download Subsurface Dive Planner, and you can plan your dives with that as well. It's completely free. So, or you can just print off a copy of the sea level equivalent depth table. I like to remember this number 2 right here. This is going to be gold for you guys. As you ascend, simply add 3.5%. So if we're diving Yellowstone Lake, it's at 7,600 foot elevation. So all I need to do is 7.6 times 3.5. I know now that Yellowstone is 26.6% deeper than what I think it is. So if I'm diving 100 feet, now it's 127 feet. Simple enough. 3.5% gets you there very easily. So we got to remember a couple things. For every 1,000 feet we ascend, 2 hours. For every 1,000 feet we ascend, we're 3.5% deeper. There's your cheat sheet for the day. I have one more cheat sheet coming up. So there's 3 quick cheats for you. This is number 2. Does that make sense, guys? Do you think
Yes.
that 1,000 foot makes it a little easier?
Yep, absolutely.
I have, and I've gone through and done the math on it on just about every elevation and dynamic you can come up with during storms, and that will get you very close, and it'll get you substantially closer. It'll keep you within about 5 to 8%, and that's when you come to dive planning. That's fantastic. Now, if you start getting into hardcore dive planning, and you're going to be diving the deck of the SS Tahoe, then I would encourage you to do the actual math. But by that point, you're going to be using subsurface, and you're going to be doing a very complicated dive and a lot more dive planning. But then again, your window for error is a lot thinner. All right. So let's review some questions here. A flexible gas-filled container is submerged to 33 feet freshwater at an altitude of 3,300 feet. At that depth, it has a volume of 1 cubic foot. What is the volume? What will the volume be if it reaches the surface? 33 cubic feet at 3,000 foot elevation.
3,000 feet.
2.21 cubic feet.
2.21 is exactly right. Why?
Because you've got less pressure at the surface. 3.5% per 1,000 feet.
Exactly. That's exactly right. So you have less pressure at the surface. You're literally, if you multiply that out, 3 times 3.5%, now you're 10.5% deeper than what you thought you were. So if you're 10.5% deeper than you thought, so 33 times 1.1, now you're at 36.3 feet. So you're deeper than what you thought. So if you're deeper than what you thought, you're going to have a greater pressure differentiation change. And so the 2.21 is exactly right. Good job, guys. All right, so discussion. What's the most accurate way to determine the SLED, the sea level equivalent depth? Donnie, what do you think?
The most accurate would probably be the that barometer app you were talking about, being able to know the actual air pressure at the time.
Absolutely. That's absolutely the most accurate. So how about you, Aaron? How would this affect your ascent rate?
You would have to slow your ascent rate and stop at a deeper depth for off-gassing.
Deeper depth or shallower depth?
A deeper depth.
You sure?
Because
if my normal safety stop is at 10 feet.
well, your theoretical depth is deeper than your actual depth. So I'd say your safety stop would have to be deeper.
Shallower, because remember, if I do a deeper depth than that, and if I'm used to doing 20 feet, and I'm at 7,600 foot elevation, all of a sudden that 20 feet becomes 26 feet, right?
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, inverse. Sorry,
there
inverse
you go.
Proportionate.
For shallower.
Yep.
And that's why, for example, let's see. Go back to dive, buddy. I like cheat. We'll just cheat. We're doing a 7,600 foot elevation dive to 100 feet. Calculate. The depth of your safety stop should be 12 feet in fresh water based on a 20-foot depth, normal safety stop depth. So we're coming up shallower because if I'm at 12 feet, it's the same as being at the 20-foot mark, right? Does that make sense?
Okay.
Yeah, I
Okay.
just was not thinking the inversely proportionate on that. So
No worries. All right. And so you already answered the next question. How would that affect your safety stop? So Donnie, where would be additional consideration for traveling after diving? Consideration for traveling after diving in altitude. What additional things should you take into consideration?
Well, if you change altitude after you dive, it would also count as a repetitive dive.
Absolutely. Same as flying and driving, right?
Right.
Absolutely. So we're going to cover that in just a moment. Now, from the SSI altitude pressure variation table, what is the atmospheric pressure for 4,000 feet, Donnie?
Let's see. So 3.5, 4, 14% less. So that's going to be.
And there might be a table in front of you.
Oh, yeah, that would help. I can just look at it. It's A, yeah. Wait. 864 ATA.
4864 AT is exactly right. And you can multiply that out. So we're talking about 4,000 feet. 4,000 times 3.5 is 14%. So basically it's going to be 0.86. So to be very accurate, it's 0.864, but you can still use the same formula. As you can see, they both add out, right? And you're literally 4,000th of a percent off. That's pretty good. I'm gonna say if you're only 4,000th of a point off, or a foot off, or a minute off on something, I think you're going to be okay based on current safety additions. So, Aaron, for you, a diver plans a dive at 4,000 feet to 70 feet fresh water. What is his sea level equivalent depth or sled?
$81 feet.
81 feet.
It's 80 feet, but 81 is the what it comes out to.
Good job. 81 feet is exactly right. Good job. All right. I think both of you are signed up for Science of Diving, so we can go into that briefly. But Science of Diving, we're going to cover a lot more of this in a lot more depth, plus the dive maladies and the some of the physics of diving as well. So definitely a great class to go through. So let's talk a little bit about Henry's Law. Anybody remember Henry's Law? Any mind, Henry?
That's the temperature to pressure law, correct?
Yes, and how it affects the bodies. So Henry's Law states that at a constant temperature, the amount of a given gas dissolved in a given type of liquid. Let's see. Let me read this again. Henry's Law states that at a constant temperature, the amount of given gas dissolved in a given type and volume of liquid is directly proportional to the partial pressure of the gas in an equilibrium of the liquid. It's a scientific law. So the law essentially has two parts. The one part states that as the pressure increases, the solubility of the gases in the liquid increases as well. Okay. So basically what it's telling you is as we go deeper, the partial pressure of that will start being more soluble in our blood and as it goes out to the tissue structures, right? The second part of that states is as the temperature increases, the solubilities of the gases in the liquids decrease. Now that's important for what we're talking about. And here's why I think that the cooler the liquid, the more gas can be absorbed by it. And as the liquid warms up, the gases escape from it. So mountain lakes, warmer or colder than the ocean?
Colder.
Yeah. Ice diving, colder than most diving?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So what do you take from that? If most gases absorb more in cold liquid, what do you think that means when it comes to partial pressures and our body?
Take us longer than off-gas nitrogen in a cold environment.
Absolutely. For a couple of reasons. There's actually several reasons. The first one is that we in a colder liquid, it's more soluble. We're going to take on more gas, right? That's
Right.
that's what we're talking about here with Henry. Is that I want to see your bright shining faces again. Stop presenting. So that's what we're talking about right here. Is that as the liquid gets colder, it's going to absorb more in our system. Now, there's another part of that as well, and we'll talk about that more in depth in a moment with hypothermia, shunting, and reduced gas flow as well as vasoconstriction. But if we just look at just Henry's law, we start realizing that as we get colder, we're going to take on more nitrogen, and it's going to stay in our system more. It doesn't come out quickly until it starts getting warm. When it gets warm, it'll come out fast. So we're able to off-gas nitrogen better in a warm environment. So if we're diving Florida at 82 degrees, nitrogen and the partial pressure of oxygen will off-gas a lot faster and a lot more easily than it will in cold water, just based upon the solubility aspect of it. So there's still two other parts of that we'll go over it a little bit. So now safety stops. Now, due to this additional consideration, safety stops in a sense must be more closely monitored for the safety of the diver, and it's imperative. Now, I don't know if have either of you dove the crater in Utah in the Homestead?
No, not yet.
Okay, so craters at 6,500 foot elevation. On the back on the security waiver that you sign your life away on for the crater, did you realize that they have it written in their contract that you will not ascend faster than 20 feet per minute? Now, granted, that water is 85 degrees, but we're dealing with a different partial pressure. We're dealing with deeper depths. So there's a couple parts of that. We have to be aware that as we're at a higher altitude, we have to ascend slower. As we get colder, we have to ascend slower. And that's just based upon altitude and Henry's law because we're getting colder. Now, safety stops of 3 to 5 minutes at near 15 feet are recommended for any dive made to a depth of 20 feet or deeper, unless an emergency or other safety related reasons dictate otherwise. But because most altitude dives are done in higher elevations and the divers are more prone to cold and reduced blood flow to the extremities, as well as the effects of Henry's law, it's strongly recommended that the following procedures be implemented. All rates should be reduced by 5 feet per minute or more for every 4,000 feet of elevation. That makes sense? So slow down by, if you're used to doing 30 feet per minute and you go up to, and you're at Ryrie, slow down to 25 feet per minute or slower. Make sense? Safety stops should be adjusted to correct for the theoretical depth based upon the dive site. If I'm at Ryrie and I'm at 4,500 feet, I need to be aware if I'm used to doing a 20-foot safety stop, I need to pull that up to 15 feet. A shallower safety stop. Now, safety times should be increased by a factor of 20% or more for every 4,000 feet of elevation. So if I'm diving and I'm used to doing a 3-minute safety stop at the ocean, in the ocean for a basic recreational dive, and I'm diving Ryrie Reservoir, now all of a sudden I need to make sure I'm increasing that by 20%. And how that looks is a whole nother minute. So 20, 40, 60, right? So it's going to be 20 seconds for every 1 minute. So instead of doing a 3-minute safety stop, I should do a 4-minute safety stop. Make sense?
Yes.
Now, typically, more cold water dives are ended due to exposure to the cold and discomfort. That's due to the dive length, not the non-decompression limits. Now, due to this, it's recommended that the divers keep a continual mental and physical assessment of their comfort level and ensure to end the dive with enough time to allow for a slow ascent and a sufficient safety stop. Ending your dive prior to strong discomfort and shivering will not only increase the satisfaction of your dive, but increase your safety level as well. So if you're in that dive, is what I'm trying to say, is that, and you're at 30 feet and you are starting to get cold, go ahead and ascend. Don't wait till the point where you lose dexterity, where you lose motor skills, because all you're doing is not only making your dive uncomfortable, but you're increasing the risk factor to deal with. Now,
I'm back on your slides.
This is just us talking. I'm getting ready to go back to slides in just a moment.
It sounds like you're reading off a slide.
Oh, I'm sorry. I've got some notes for me that I read through, and then I go through with what you got as well. So as we go through this, just be aware that you've got to go through and slow your time down. If you start to get cold, you've got to make sure you're ending your dive prior to that. And like we talked about earlier, you've got to make sure you're checking in mentally with yourself on a regular basis. We all know that what happens when we start getting hypothermia is we start losing cognitive ability. We start losing the fine motor skills, but we start we're guys already. We already have a predetermination to make bad decisions already. But once we start getting cold, those bad decisions turn into really bad decisions. All right, let's go ahead and share my screen again. Let's see. Go back over here. All right. So thermal considerations while we're diving. We need to make sure to understand and discuss the exposure protection before, during, and after the dive. The effects of altitude on atmospheric pressure, the role of the atmospheric pressure in dive table calculations, include the benefits of dry suits, using shelter for pre-dressing and post-dive undressing, warm liquids, and hydrations. So, Donnie, how important was that little hut that we brought out with the heater?
That was very important. I figure there were at least 3 or 4 times that someone needed to warm up some tissue to make sure that it wasn't didn't lack dexterity in their hands or their feet or something, and that was definitely a lifesaver. Probably as far as gas absorption goes, as well as just comfort.
Absolutely. So we already kind of understand the idea of during and after the dive that we need to have some sort of protection. A dry suit is to our advantage, right? But we also need to understand that as we're dealing with this, we're dealing with cold as well as reduced atmospheric pressure. So we're having to deal with letting that nitrogen come out. So we need to make sure we're warm and allowing that atmospheric pressure to come out of our system correctly. Using a shelter for pre-dressing and undressing, definitely huge. Having some warm liquids is going to be a big thing as well. Making sure we stay warm during our dive. So either of you want to do any of those ice dives in a wetsuit?
No, never.
No.
I did the first 10 I did in a wetsuit.
Was it very fun though, was it?
It was all right, but getting out was bad. It was really cold.
Yeah, you definitely know you're in a cold situation. I've had this happen more than once, where I was getting ready to go down for a 3rd or 4th dive on a training session for ice diving, and feel my fingers getting cold and thinking I'll just power through this next dive because my fingers were getting cold at the surface. Get down and start the next dive and have my fingers warm up because the water was warmer than the air temperature.
Yeah, when the water's 37 and the air's 15, the water
Yes.
feels nice.
Yes, it definitely feels nice. But that should scare you as well. That all of a sudden you're thinking 37-degree water feels nice. So, discussion. How would cold affect the nitrogen loading and off-gassing? I think we've gone through this, but give me kind of some ideas here, guys.
Increased nitrogen loading and slower off-gassing.
Absolutely. Why?
The nitrogen dissolves fat or more efficiently in cold water.
Absolutely. How about the effect of reduced atmospheric pressure on surface intervals? What do you think, Donnie?
If we're adding 20% or 40% at this altitude, really, just to try to counter the. Well, hold on. No, you're talking about. Yeah. Then I mean, let's see, both the time it requires for the gas to leave your tissue and the fact that it's going to be colder.
That's it's going to slow everything down, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and if we're at a reduced atmospheric pressure, we're not getting as much oxygen, right? So we know that if we're at 15% below atmospheric normal pressure for full ATA, then we're literally breathing in a partial pressure. If we're not used to breathing in 21% oxygen times 0.85, we are literally breathing in 17% oxygen instead, right?
Okay.
So atmospheric pressure, oxygen partial pressure is actually 17%. right? I feel like I just blew your doors there. You got that confused look.
Yeah, no, I'm trying to get it because partial pressures have been messing with me for a while. So the volume's the same. You still have 21% volume, but because we're at reduced partial pressure,
is it equivalent of 17% instead?
Equivalent for absorption in the lungs.
Exactly.
Okay. So, and let's see. So, and nitrogen's gonna be affected the same way. So that if that's 0.78 something,
Just say it's 0.79.
0.79 of nitrogen, then you're gonna get
67%.
Okay.
So the partial pressure what you're breathing in nitrogen is 0.67. The partial pressure of oxygen is 0.17. Have you ever noticed on your dive computer? Let's see if so you've got your dive computer and you ever look at it and have it show you the partial pressure lower than 0.21?
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's because it's reading the partial pressure of with atmospheric pressure based upon altitude. The altitude partial pressure is lower. So the equivalent of what your absorption is going to be 17% oxygen.
So less oxygen to displace nitrogen is going to slow down off-gassing as well?
Exactly.
Okay.
You got it. You picked it up exactly.
Gotcha.
All righty. So pre-dive safety checks. So I'm just going to read the slide for you, just so you know. Each diver should conduct a functional check of all gear and equipment before the dive. Particular attention should be paid to regulators, inflator valves. If leaking or free flowing is detected in these, the dive should be postponed until after malfunction is corrected. Now, if a regulator or inflator valve is found to be free flowing on the surface, it's virtually certain that it will start free flowing at depth. Now, likewise, divers should perform pre-buddied dive checks with their fellow divers before each dive. It can be easy to forget to attach an inflator hose or strap, and a quick check to make sure can start the dive off correctly. Now, divers should go over what hand and arm signals they use in emergency and otherwise, a quick review of the dive plan and what other hazards might be present during the upcoming dive. It's also recommended that if a diver is going to be at a site that is far away, they should bring along a spare regulator in case one of the diver's regulators malfunctions. They should also take extra thermal undergarments, cold weather gear, dive gloves, liners in case of a leak in the dry suit. Now, I can tell you just from personal experience, and if you're diving cold, taking an extra pair of warm socks and an extra sweatshirt is a game changer. And I'll be perfectly frank with you, on Saturday after our ice dives, I went in the tent, took my dry suit off, pulled out my dry socks. They were wonderful. As I took my undergarments on, I put a fresh dry sweatshirt on, fresh dry socks, put my boots on. It was wonderful. It was heaven on earth. So take a few extra pieces of gear to make sure. Extra regulators is definitely not a bad idea either. So all divers should be able to disconnect the dry suit LP hose from the dry suit inflator valve with gloved or mittened hands. Otherwise, the dry suit inflator free flow in the water could result in an uncontrolled ascent. Now, remember that your dive buddy is there to help as well. It's good technique to practice this action at the end of the dive during the safety stop. That's when the diver is close to the hole and the hands are the coldest. So what I'm saying is, if you're going to practice this, practice it at the end of the dive, but you should be able to get your own inflator on and off. And it's one of the things that I definitely encourage. I don't know if you guys noticed it on Saturday, but I won't hook anybody's dry hose up. I'll hand them their dry hose, but I will not do it for them. And I don't let anybody hook up my dry hose. I want to make sure that as I'm an instructor or on a dive site, that I'm watching to make sure somebody can do their own inflator hoses. So as we're getting into cold water, that they are safe and able to disconnect. Simple things like that. So discussion, how could redundant equipment help you in high altitude diving before the dive or during the dive? What do you guys think?
If, say, you have a malfunction in one of your regulators, you can easily change it.
Absolutely.
With a dive.
Donnie, did anybody have a free flow at on Saturday?
I believe almost half of us had free flows on Saturday. I think my last dive, I free flowed for the last 10 minutes of the dive, just trying to get it to work. But we just kept watching our pressures to make sure we weren't going through gas too fast and kept fixing it on the fly.
Absolutely. So, but it's nice to have another regulator, and extra gear. For example, I think if I remember right, you end up using Nikki's hood.
Yeah, I ended up using her hood because I didn't think I'd need something thicker, which was a mistake. And I did have a regular hose. I just didn't take the time to get out and use it.
Absolutely. How about spare gas? You think that might be important?
Yeah, especially considering how we're increasing our depth. I wouldn't want to be trying to complete a safety stop, making sure that I get the nitrogen out and then run out of gas.
Absolutely.
We're in a free flow situation. You have a backup bottle to complete that safety stop.
Absolutely. Now, my suggestion in a free flow emergency like that, and you do have a pony bottle, breathe off the gas off your primary cylinder first, and don't go to your secondary regulator. Breathe out the free flow regulator first. I mean, that makes no sense to have one gas completely flowing and then breathing off a second hose to increase the amount of gas going through. Breathe out the free flow regulator first. If you're trying to do your safety stop, and then as you're doing your safety stop, if it does run out, then switch to your secondary. Don't immediately say, oh crap, I'm on a free flow, I should switch to my pony. Go ahead and breathe that gas off, because that gives you additional time. If you've got 2 minutes to that for that tank to go dry on you, that gives you 2 minutes worth of gas that you don't have to breathe off your pony.
Right.
So you've got two additional minutes of dive time. But if you do go to free flow, the standard policy is that you're to begin your ascent and exit immediately. The dive has now ended. Now, a couple other things to think about in terms of redundancy. There's a couple different ways to do this. You can certainly do a pony bottle or a completely redundant bottle. My suggestion on this, I have tried to use tank setups like this where it's attached to my tank. Here's the problem. When it's on your back like this, if something were to happen and you had a bubbler or a leaky O-ring, you would never know. Your gas will be gone and you will not have the ability to do anything about it. If you go to a free flow on this, you won't be able to feather your regulator. My suggestion is always go to a side mounted pony bottle or deco bottle, because what you can do is the procedure should be charge it up, check it, make sure it works, and then while charged, turn it off. That way, as you're diving through the process, it can never go to free flow. And even if it did, it's only going to free flow for about a second or two, and before it just runs out of gas. You won't lose all your gas. Now, there are a couple other options. You can certainly go to a Y valve or an H valve. And what this allows you to do, that if your regulator goes to a free flow, you're able to isolate out and go to a second regulator. You can also do twin sets as well, where you have the ability to have two separate first stages and two separate second stages that are completely independent one of another. So that if something happens, I can isolate out, turn the other one off, and then I can just go to my secondary on my other. So having an independent H or Y valve or a pony bottle is definitely a good idea, especially if you're diving at altitude. Make sure you have a good, strong air delivery system as well. As you've seen, Donnie, did you see any of my gear go to free flow?
No, you had some good gear.
Yeah, so, and that's because everything I've got is designed for extreme cold weather. So as you go through this process, look up the manufacturer's specs and take a look. The set you see here is the MTXR. It's designed for the military at extreme cold weather. I use the XTX 50s, which is the step below this, and it's rated for cold weather as well. I also use an OTS reg set as well, and I think, Aaron, you might be a little familiar with OTS FFMs. You got a little bit of experience with those?
I have the Oceanic Galatia, or the Aqualung Galatia, which is
Gotcha.
rated the same as this, just an older model.
Gotcha. But you're a little familiar with the OTS FFMs, aren't you?
Yes. No, I've only worn one out or had to rebuild it once.
Right on. Now, the next thing to take a look at is your computer. Certainly go through the manual and make sure that how it sets itself to altitude. Now, this particular computer that you're looking at is a Sunto Core. you have to go into the settings and you have to set it for the altitude that you're at. My latest toy in the line is the Apex DSX. It's an automatic. I also dive the Shearwater Perdix. It's automatic for altitude adjustment, as well as my Garmin Mark II is automatic to altitude as well. But go through and make sure that whatever computer you're diving, before your dives, make sure to check it. Make sure, does it automatically adjust to altitude or does it not? Because that's definitely going to make a difference when it comes to its algorithmic differences. I think we've got a pretty good idea what it looks like to dive in the lakes. These are all three photos from different lakes in the area. But in diving the lakes, we have to be aware of visibility conditions. Typically, we have a lot of turbidity in the water, as well as algae bloom during the summer. So it's one of the reasons I like to dive deep whenever I dive lakes. If I can get below the 50, 60, 70 foot mark, it clears up completely, but it turns into a night dive. So making sure I have a good quality light with me is definitely the key. The other challenge with lake diving as well is usually to get out to where you want to do the dive, you're going to have to do some surface swimming. So in doing that, make sure you take the time to do your surface swim slow. For example, when we dive Yellowstone Lake, it's an 1,100 foot surface swim. It takes about 15 to 20 minutes to swim out to where we want to be. Other considerations, be aware of what the environmental conditions look like. You know, just because it looks great doesn't mean it always is. Sometimes you have a nice set of stairs to walk right down to. Sometimes you're going to have to go over some rocks and other things as well. Be aware, was there a forest there? I've gotten into more than one forest underwater as well. Be definitely considerate of the water temperature of what you're getting ready to dive and wear appropriate thermal gear, as well as entanglement hazards. I've gotten tangled up in Ryrie a couple times on different things, boat ropes, fishing line, as well as I got caught up in a little forest as well. So be careful of that and be aware. River diving, definitely got to be aware. Aaron, have you ever had really great visibility in a river?
Yeah, when I was outside of it.
I've never had good river visibility. So you have to be aware, once you get into start river diving, the best visibility that I've ever had was probably Firehole River. And that's got pretty decent visibility. You've got about 30 to 40 feet of viz in Firehole River, but you start to get into overhead environments as well. So definitely need to be aware that as you're starting to get into this reduced visibility and into a current, you're going to have rocks, you're going to have current, and you have other things to be aware of. And you need to understand what those conditions are before you start getting into them. Also, what's the water temp? Most rivers are cold. They're kicking along. The fact, the coldest dive I've ever had was out at, in front of Idaho, right here in the middle of Idaho Falls, running water at 29 degrees Fahrenheit. Flat out cold. Firehole River is kind of a little different. It's thermal, so it comes out at 60 degrees year round, which is kind of nice. But also be aware as you get into the river, you never see entanglement hazards in a river, do you? Do you, Aaron? It's always perfect and clear, right?
You never see them, but they're there.
Because the visibility.
Yeah, they're always. I don't know any time I've dove the river, I haven't caught something, a stick or something someone's left, or garbage, or a rock, or something.
Absolutely. And then just dealing with a current. How does Aaron tell us about dealing in the current with the current?
Depending on which regulator you've got, it'll actually pull air out of your regulator. The current flowing past your exhaust will free flow it. Dry suit valves will leak in the current. You got to kick a lot harder to stay where you're going. Use a lot of air.
Absolutely. You get air stolen from you, but you also have a lot more exertion as well. So as we get ready to do these altitude dives, we need to think a little bit more deeply about things like the emergency procedures. Where's the location of emergency services? Is there an O2 provider around? Where's an AED? And what's the distance to a pressurization chamber? Now, overall, any emergency situation, we need to make sure that we're dealing with a stop, breathe, think, act decision, right? In an emergency situation, you need to regain control before you act. And the best way to regain control is to immediately stop, calm down, and take a breath. This will relax you and help you make a rational decision. But in this case, a little proper planning goes a long way. Remember the 5 Ps. Proper planning prevents poor performance, right? I actually taught a class not long ago where nobody had heard of the 5 Ps. I about fell over. I was like, really? But so a little proper planning. We want to make sure that before we have to do the stop, breathe, think, and act, that we know a few answers to the questions. For example, Yellowstone Lake. Where's the closest emergency location? They have a little clinic that's about 7-8 miles from where we dive at. But do they have oxygen? I honestly don't know. So as we dive these remote locations, Nikki and I carry 2 bottles of pure oxygen with us. We've got enough air for both of us for an hour if something were to happen. So O2. Yeah. So we've got, but an AED, what happens if somebody, did you know 58% of dive maladies are cardiac related? So we need to know where that's at. And the distance to the chamber, we know that there are 8 chambers in Idaho Falls, but that's a 3.5-hour drive from us. So be aware. And as you start putting together these altitude dives, realize you're a lot farther from emergency services than you might think. So decompression sickness, there's a lot of different ways to get this. One of the things that most people don't realize is dehydration is the biggest concern for altitude diving. We get more dehydrated the higher we go and the lower the partial pressure. So drink water. And I don't know if you can see my little sticker, but that's our theory on diving. But remember, there's old divers and bold divers, but there's no old bold divers. It says go do dangerous shit. Black mass divers. But overall, dehydration is one of the biggest concerns in altitude. So in this environment, the onset of dehydration can come in very quickly and insidiously. Divers should make an effort to stay hydrated. The trick to this is, and I'll tell you just from personal experience, that diving at altitude and being well hydrated in a dry suit is not always your best friend. So, but please make sure you hydrate and hydrate often. If you are not hydrated correctly, you can actually increase your chance of getting DCS, because as your blood thickens up, it's not able to allow you to off gas as easily. So be aware. It also hardens the tissue and hardens the muscles and doesn't allow the gases to escape out of your tissue compartments quite as easily as well. So just be aware of the signs and symptoms of dehydration are dry mouth, feeling of thirsty, dry tongue, let's see, dark colored urine, dry skin, feeling tired, and dizziness. If you feel any of those, don't be afraid to take a big drink of water. Okay. Hypothermia. I think we've all got a pretty good understanding of hypothermia, but let's talk about it in terms of how it affects diving. So the first thing that happens when you start getting cold is your body starts going into a shunted mode. And what that means to you is the brain kicks in and says, I've got to protect 4 things. They're on the screen for you, so I'll just read them off for you instead of asking. But those 4 things, it's going to make sure it gets blood flow to the brain, heart, liver, and lungs first. Everything else can just sawed off, right? It reduces blood flow to those as well. But there's another thing that happens as well. As we start getting cold, we go into vasoconstriction. So while the brain is kicking in and saying, I need to reduce the amount of blood flow out there, our body by natural osmosis here is also going into a condition called blood shunting, because as we get cold, things constrict, right?
Right.
Absolutely. So now we know Henry kicked in and that more gas is going to dissolve and flow in cold, but now we also have to deal with reduced blood flow and vasoconstriction. So as our venous system gets more constricted, it lets less blood through. So if we're trying to flush out the stock tanks out in the pasture, and we're using a hose that's got a kink in it, it takes a long freaking time, right? We want to get the biggest system we can. And what it ends up happening with vasoconstriction is it literally compresses and constricts those veins and doesn't let nearly as much flow to go through them. With less blood flow comes less off-gassing ability. Now, just be aware, cold water can affect your body and your mental faculties as well. It prevents clear thinking. It prevents your ability for cognitive reason, as well as functioning ability of your hands and fingers. Now, here's one you may or may not have heard of before, and this is a new one. It's only been being studied since about 2016, truthfully. It's called immersion pulmonary edema. And this is a very common, or not a very common, but this is a more common thing in cold water. Now, when we're immersed in water, the hydrostatic pressure causes a compression of the leg veins, and as a result, that blood that normally pools in our legs is pushed centrally into the chest. This increases the central blood volume and increases the pressure in the alveolar capillaries and may cause fluid to leak into the lungs and cause difficulty breathing. And if it's not corrected, can cause death. Now, one of the first cases I heard about of this was a case that it was in England. They were diving in 2016, and they were diving in a quarry. There was an instructor, an assistant instructor, and a student. Okay. The student was a little more heavy set. The instructor was a technical dive instructor. They were all diving twin sets, HP 100s. They had a longer surface swim. And when they got out to their location, the student complained of not being able to catch his breath. So they stopped and waited for a little bit. They went down, they did their 100-foot dive. And as they started their ascent, the student immediately had issues and complained that he was out of gas after a 15 to 20-minute dive. The instructor put the student onto the assistant instructor's gas supply, twin sets. They got to their safety stop, and again, the student complained that he didn't have any air, that he was out of air. The instructor couldn't believe it, but he knew he had plenty of air gas in his system, so he gave the student his gas supply. So he was air sharing with the student. At about a minute in the safety stop, the student started to panic and began an attempt to make an emergency ascent. The instructor grabbed him, calmed him down, and held him down for the last of the 2 minutes to do a complete safety stop. As they started their ascent, the student's eyes rolled back in his head, and he apparently stopped breathing. They got him to the surface. He was not breathing. They did their surface swim back to the shore, began compressions, but unfortunately the student died. What had happened was IPO, immersion pulmonary edema. And where this is the most common is people who have hypertension or high blood pressure. Now, it's key to understand that if you have high blood pressure and you're taking medication, it doesn't mean you're cured. It means you're treating it. You've got to be aware of these type of situations and be honest with them. If you're not honest to the situation, you open yourself up to a lot of different liabilities. I know of a situation that happened very similar to this of a friend of mine that was diving a cave. They were an hour into a cave, and their student began to head into emergency pulmonary edema. And they ended up putting him on another gas supply. He passed out. They got him to about 15 minutes to the exit of the cave, and were able to get him through. And he ended up coming back to life and didn't remember anything. But he had enough edema happen in the interior of his lungs to cause him to pass out from lack of oxygen. So the easiest way to avoid this, be aware. Hypertension medications for high blood pressure, hypertension are definitely putting you into a high-risk situation. Hydration. Make sure the divers do not drink excessive fluids prior to dive, but they are hydrated. And make sure exercise. Extreme levels of exercise can contribute to IPO. So if you're diving a river or a long surface swim, make sure that you're taking that into account as well. But it does mimic completely the signs and symptoms of drowning. If you have a diver that is complaining, has breathing difficulties when not exercising, that is particularly stressful. Breathing difficulties may be indicated by rapid, uneven, and heavy breathing and coughing uncontrollably. Confusion, swimming in the wrong direction or random directions, inability to carry out normal functions, belief that a regulator is not working properly, indication of out of gas when the regulators are found to be working in correct order, diver refusing to or rejecting an alternate air source when out of gas, indication or difficulty breathing when on the surface. So if you have any of those symptoms, stop, reset the dive. And I just want to just put a shout out to Donnie on Saturday. You resetting your dive, you went down, you were down for a minute or two and came back up, got out of the hole and said, I need to reset, and went in the tent, got warm, reset yourself, reset your dive. That's awesome. too few people have the understanding and ability to stop and say, I'm going to reset this dive. I'm going to start again. And I'm going to quit this dive because I don't need this. So other considerations of physical for altitude diving: hydration. Make sure you stay hydrated. Hypoxia at altitude, not enough air. Altitude diving can cause thermal stress, getting too cold, and driving after diving. So that's another big one. So remember, after dive travel for an altitude dive, so after diving it's important to know what group designation you are in based upon the combination of air nitrox tables. So simple enough, if I come out and I'm a K group diver, I need to realize that as I'm getting ready to ascend. Now, remember, I need to make sure that I'm back to an A group diver before I ascend in altitude. So here's a good example. If I'm at the crater at 6,500 foot elevation, the mountain range that I have to go to, whether it's north or south, is 3,000 feet of elevation. So what do I need to do, guys?
Add 3. Hold on. It's one letter group per 1,000 feet. I forgot what altitude you said, but
yeah. So I just need to add 3 groups. So if I come out as a C group diver, I'm going to become an E. I need to realize that to go up, it's going to make me an E group diver. So I need to make sure as a C group diver that I'm staying 2 hours for every 1,000 feet, right? So if I come out as a C group diver, I need to stay back and I need to become an A group diver. So 2 hours for every 1,000 feet I'm going to ascend. Make sense? So basically, if I come out of the crater, I need to make sure that I stay out for 2 to 4 hours at least before I leave the crater and drive back to Salt Lake. Does it make sense? Yeah. So take time, change your letter group back down. So determine the proper no travel time, determine what the maximum altitude change for your dive will be, and spend each letter group is equivalent to 2 hours for every 1,000 feet. So prior to travel, a diver should be back to an A group diver. So if I'm traveling, for example, 3,000 feet, that's 6 hours. I need to stay at location for 6 hours before I travel back to make sure I'm an A group diver, to make sure I'm safe. Same thing with Yellowstone. I'm going to go over Mountain Pass. I need to stay 2 hours for every 1,000 feet to make sure I get back to an A group diver to be safe. Make sense? Take your time after a dive. Now, summary overall, we talked about how pressure shifts at altitude and it impacts the diver, how to use theoretical depths as a compensation for decreased surface pressures. We learned about the physiological considerations for altitude diving. Diving altitude, so the objective was because the reduced atmospheric pressure dives conducted at altitude require more decompression than identical dives conducted at sea level. The standard dive tables can't be used as written. Now, through this class, we learned several alternative approaches to determining safe diving practices for diving at altitude, as well as additional safety practices for emergencies. Now, I'm going to skip this because both you guys are well past this. So diving altitude, the value for you guys, again, a majority of inland diving is at altitude and can present additional risks that may not be as simple as diving at sea level. This course would help prepare you to dive at those additional challenges and provide them with the additional safety plan to execute dives between 1,000 and 10,000 feet. Think you guys are ready for a final exam?
Yes.
Sure.
All right. We'll go one by one. Aaron, number 1, what is the minimum altitude to consider an altitude dive?
1,000 feet.
1,000 feet is exactly right. Donnie, what is the maximum recommended altitude for altitude diving?
D, 10,000 feet.
That's exactly right. Aaron, there are several contributing factors for decompression illness. Which one is the greatest concern for altitude diving?
Dehydration.
Dehydration sneaks up on you. You can identify high altitude dives by the presence of mountain terrain. Donnie?
B, false. You can have high plane areas as well.
Aaron, at sea level, a flexible gas-filled container is submerged to 33 feet seawater. At 1 at the depth it has a volume of 1 cubic foot. What is the volume of the container will be at if it's brought directly to the surface?
2 cubic feet.
2 cubic feet is exactly right. Donnie, the container in question 5 is brought to the surface, but from an altitude of 3,000 feet. What will the volume of that be when it reaches the surface?
Let's see, that should be D, 2.21 cubic feet.
Exactly right. Aaron, from the SSI altitude pressure variation table, what is the atmospheric pressure at 4,000 feet?
0.864 A,
Exactly. And what's our differentiation for every 1,000 feet?
3.5%.
Exactly. Easy way to remember it. Donnie, most common dive tables rely on a minimum hydrostatic cap of what at the surface?
1.0 ATA.
Correct. Aaron, a diver plans a dive at 4,000 feet to 70 feet fresh water. What is the equivalent depth at sea level?
80 feet.
80 feet is exactly right. I think I had you answer that one earlier too.
Yep.
What advantage, Donnie, does a valve with a separate outlet provide for an altitude diver?
Let's see. A redundant system in case of freeze-ups in cold water.
Exactly. What is preferred method for preventing hypothermia when altitude diving?
Using a dry suit.
Yep. I think we've got a little experience in those dry suits. Safety stop depth should be adjusted as you ascend in altitude. True or false, Donnie?
Yes, they should be adjusted.
Absolutely. Deeper or shallower, Donnie?
Shallower.
Absolutely. All right, Aaron. A number of water skills are vital to managing risks on every dive. Which of the following skills is most critical to an altitude diver?
Ascent rate control.
Descent rate control is exactly right. We're sending faster than what you think, right?
Yep.
A diver completes a dive to a sled at sea level equivalent depth of 60 feet freshwater for 45 minutes. What is the minimum surface interval time before ascending 4,000 feet in elevation?
Let's see. 60 feet, 45 minutes. Oh, this is the nitric table. That's going to be the same anyway. So let's do 8 hours.
8 hours is exactly right. Why?
2 hours per 1,000 feet altitude.
Exactly. Aaron, I'm glad you have a screen because you'll need it. A diver completes travel from his location that is 5,000 feet above elevation, above his home location for a dive. What letter group for residual nitrogen would the diver need to start at to account for the elevation difference?
F group.
F group is exactly right. Donnie, can you see that?
Yes.
All right. A diver travels from a location that's 3,000 feet above his home location for a dive. How long would he need to wait prior to diving to become an A group diver? Prior to the dive.
C, 5 hours, 49 minutes.
That's exactly right. All right. And finally, Aaron, a diver who is diving at altitude can make repetitive dives in the same day.
True.
True is exactly right. All right. Congratulations, guys. You are now, let's see. Oh, okay. You're now altitude diver certified. I've got some paperwork at the shop for you on Monday to sign if you wouldn't mind just popping in. If you'd like, I'm happy to send you this entire deck. If you click at the end of it, you'll notice that I've got all the ascent rate calculations for you. But I tried to bridge note it for you as well.
Perfect.
Again, I encourage you guys to go to the Teach Me to Dive YouTube channel. I've got a bunch of high altitude dives and as well as some dives at Yellowstone Lake that are pretty neat to watch. So take your time and go check those out. What questions do you guys have at this point, guys?
I'm good. I think you've explained it really well.
Excellent. Donnie, what questions do you have?
I think that covers everything for me.
Gotcha. Well, you both passed Like I said, there's paperwork waiting for you at the shop on Monday. I just got to get Ashley to print it out. If she doesn't print it out, I'll print it out myself. So you'll be all good to go. All right. Well, congratulations. You guys are altitude certified. And I'll get you all signed off.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Yep. See ya.
See you, Ben.